So today I'm going to be talking about A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. And if you've been watching this channel recently, you'll know that I am currently taking a course in young adult literature where I read a book and then film a review. And I include a lot of academic thoughts for the class, but also my own thoughts on the book. So this is the third video that I'll be making. You can find my Catcher in the Rye review and my Jellicoe Road review in the description. I'm going to begin by sharing a few honest thoughts that I had about this book before I started. I'm going to be real with you here because that's what I do. At the start, I hated this book. I just finished the really fast-paced Room by Emma Donoghue in like 3 days, and in comparison, this book felt just treacherously slow. I wanted so much more conflict. I thought that nothing was gonna happen, I was really bored, and I consequently got a little bit angry because I didn't think I was gonna be able to get through this book. And then I got to page like 50 and I got over myself. Because even though kind of technically nothing happens in this book, everything also happens. It's the story of people growing up and living and dying and struggling in Brooklyn. In general, thought I was gonna hate it, ended up loving it, and cried at the end. I would really recommend this book. Before I get into spoilers, I would say that if you haven't read it, and you love reading and you love writing, you should definitely read it. So now I'm going to get into my more spoilery academic review of this book, and that starts with character. Obviously, the main character of this book is Francie Nolan. She is 11 years old when the book starts. For the majority of the book, she's like 11. Towards the end, she begins growing up. I think one of the reasons I was worried I wasn't gonna like this book was because it was like 1900s, like starts off like really talking about how things are pretty separate for men and women, and like what women do and what men do and what's acceptable. Being the purple-haired feminist that I am, I was really afraid that Francie was just gonna be someone who like went along and like did what was expected of her, and to an extent she kind of is, but in a very real way she is her own individual person who like challenges the norm. She's also like working and really passionate about what she does and reading and writing, and she is a working woman. She is just such a great character and I love watching her grow. Anyone who loves to read will immediately connect with her and love her. A few other characters in the book, it's really centered on her family. So her mother is a major player, and her relationship with her mother is a huge part of the book. You know, she is very aware from a very young age that her mother prefers her younger brother, Neely, to her. It's kind of about how she navigates that relationship, having that information. How she accepts her mother and respects her because she knows they're very similar, but like almost that love isn't there. Her father is an alcoholic, but not a mean one. He's like a great person and a nice guy, and he's almost nicer when he's drunk than he is when he's sober, and it's really sad. And her little brother was like kind of an underdog, like a silent player in the game the whole book. His development through her eyes was one of the most like heartfelt and heartbreaking moments in the story. This is when I cried at the very end when he starts singing one of the songs that her dad always sang, and she realizes that like she is her dad. You grow up and become the people who raised you, for better or for worse. It just goes back to the whole theme of the story, which is like life just happening. That subtle undercurrent of character development that just happens in life. So the next element is setting, and the setting of the story was Brooklyn, New York in the very early 1900s. I think it starts in like 1901 and it continues up. The setting is not just Brooklyn, because yeah, she learns to love her city, and she learns that, you know, through seeing other places like Manhattan that she's heard so much about, that it's really not the same as Brooklyn where she grew up, and there's that kind of nostalgia. But I think what really like made the setting come to life more than the word Brooklyn, because you can imagine what it is, but I think it was the description through a child's eyes that really made it like so vibrant. It's not just Brooklyn, it's the corner store, it's what everyone does on a Sunday, it's what the kids do, and how life happens in this space that makes the space what it is. It's really just like such a vibrant backdrop to the kind of simple story that is playing out. And that brings me to the next element of the story, which is conflict. The conflict is very simple. Essentially it's life, but more specifically it's poverty, because her family through most of the story can't even afford to buy milk. Like every penny counts. Money is a very big deal, and her mother works so hard to keep them fed and and clothes, even if that's like at the minimal, minuscule level, and she works really hard and makes sure that they have an education that's so important to her. It's also, you know, having an alcoholic father who can't provide for the family, and the stigma of that, the struggle that also comes along with it when you can't afford anything. And that's the conflict. But because it's such a vibrant setting and the characters are so vibrant, especially Francie, that conflict is not so simple. The next element is dialogue. The dialogue and the general language used in the story is different, to be sure, because it's a completely different time. It's 1901. There's certain slang and like language being used that I couldn't necessarily connect with, but it only served to like immerse you in the story more. The language is influenced by the fact that she is a child listening at the door most of the time, and that also serves to like develop her character. So dialogue and language was a very big part of this book, a very big part of setting the tone and the atmosphere, and also character development. So the next thing I have to talk about with this book are some of the bigger elements. The first one being Rites of Passage. Now I was thinking about this, and there were a lot of ways I could go with Rites of Passage with this book, because there was the basic everyday ones, like essentially growing up, not really having many friends in school, going to school, graduating, feeling that nostalgia, drinking, and family members dying. Those are basic rites of passage. The rites of passage that I noticed more were the feminine rites of passage. You know, when she looks down in the bath one day and discovers that she's turning into a woman, when she kind of sees the differences between how she is treated and how her brother Neely is treated, when she gets her first period, when her mom has a sex talk with her. These were the rites of passage that I noticed more because they were the ones that I definitely like could relate to a lot more. So the next thing I have to talk about is the impact of cultural differences. That is a big one because Francie's grandmother is from like the old country. It's 1901, so like most of the people in Brooklyn at that time are immigrants, are people who are at least first or second generation and are trying to build a new life for themselves. The way that that impacts the story is like Francie's grandmother came to America with the idea that her children were going to be more educated than she was, and their children would be more educated than they were. And there was also this idea of saving money to own land. Like education and owning land were the huge pivotal things that were going to make their lives better. It completely influenced the story. It influenced the way that people were brought up, lives were lived. So the next thing I have to talk about is the interplay of child protagonists with the world of adults. There's so much of this, especially because Francie is so young. You see so much of her like listening at the door and overhearing conversations and kind of learning about the world through the door. A big one was her relationships with her teachers, and you know, at the beginning her relationships are pretty good. Her teacher teaches her how to use writing as an outlet and use it as a way not to lie, because as a child she's just like a compulsive liar because she just wants to tell stories and embellish the truth. But later on in her years, her teacher Miss Gardner tells her that her stories are too dark, too sordid, like too real. They're about poverty, and who wants to read about that? She tells her like, stop doing this and someday you'll thank me for it. And there's this part, it says, Francie wished adults would stop telling her that. Already the load of thanks in the future was weighing her down. She figured she'd have to spend the best years of her womanhood hunting people up to tell them that they were right and to thank them. So that's another element of the interplay of child protagonists with the world of adults. She has to learn how to deal with adults who think that they're right, want her to tell them that they're right, while also knowing in her heart and her soul and her mind that they are not right. That frustration was really like palpable, especially when she like wrote out what she was gonna do. This very fantasy like dream of what's gonna happen and how she's gonna get one over on her. So the next thing I have to talk about is experiences with death and dying. Now I will say that this was definitely influenced by the time period and the setting. When Francie's father dies, it is huge because the Nolan family is dirt poor. They can barely afford to live as it is, and they were really counting on the little bit of money that Johnny Nolan brought in every once in a while. So her father dying meant so much grief and pain and hardship and struggle for her family. It meant that they might not even be able to live. So last but not least is identity development. Francie really develops enormously over the course of the story. That isn't necessarily because the story is so great and incredible, it's because the story takes place over years and years and years. She goes from being an infant, you see see her at 11, and you see her all the way up to 16. As she's growing up, she's obviously developing as a person, and you know, throughout the story you see her little quirks and you see the moments throughout where you see who she really is. You see who she could be if it weren't for her situation, if it weren't for her environment, if it weren't for the circumstances, the conditions. But those are like brief. But in the end, when you see her kind of dismiss her mother a few different times, like when she tells her, I'm going to go to school, or I'm not going to go to school, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that, or this is what's going to happen. That respect that you see that she's had for her mother is still there, but she's also learned how to like assert herself and stand up for herself and be that strong person that her mom basically raised her to be. It was so cool to see her develop and grow and be this like really independent woman, because in the beginning I was so afraid that she wasn't going to become that, and I so desperately wanted her to be. She definitely developed and grew and stood on her own 2 feet by the end. She had to learn how to like love herself and get validation from herself. I think that's really, really relatable, and also a really great message to send to young, especially female readers. Show them this character who has had all the odds stacked against her, who continues to do her own thing and be her own person. She made her own choices time and time again, and they were always the right ones for her, and I think that's a really great role model. So the very last thing that I have to talk about is how and why the book appeals to the young reader. Even though this book is set in a very different time period, the universality of Francie Nolan kind of transcends time. It's just her character. That is what got me into the book and kept me. I think if you're a reader, and if you love writing, and if your parents ever had the book Raising Your Spirited Child on their shelf, then you will relate to this book and you will relate to Francie, and even if you don't like write or you're not exactly like her, you'll love her and you'll love this story. And even though it's 1901 in Brooklyn, it's so relatable because it's that like really, really human thing. I wish I had read it when I was younger, because holy crap, this would have been such a favorite. But I'm so glad that I read it now, because related to it so much, even at 20. I think it can be poignant and relatable to anyone. In conclusion, thought I was gonna hate this book, ended up really liking it. You can honestly ask my boyfriend, because page 12 I was like so pissed off. I'm like, I'm not gonna be able to get through this book. And this morning I finished it and cried. So lesson learned, we got over ourselves. My camera shut down, don't know where it cut me off. Basically, that's all for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you liked it. I hope you've been enjoying these very long and rambly reviews. After this, I have one more book that I'll be reading for this class, and that is More Than This by Patrick Ness. I'm really glad, like I'm really happy with the books that I chose for this class, because they're books that I've been wanting to read for so long, and that was the push to do it, and I've been so glad with every one of them that I've read. So thank you for watching, hope you liked it, and I'll see you soon with another one.